Here's a video game urban legend that I'm willing to bet that you've actually heard. Back in 1982, the biggest movie around was Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which became one of the top-grossing movies of all time, as well as one of the best-reviewed films for the era. It's a story about a stranded alien visitor who befriends a young boy, who helps him build the machine he needs to contact his home. It's not exactly the sort of movie that you'd expect a hit video game to be made out of, but Atari tried just that. Only 6 months after the movie was released, out came the video game, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. E.T. is one of the most infamous video games of all time. As it's by and large terrible, many publications and critics called it the worst video game of all time. And while I feel that it's not the worst, it's pretty damn bad. And if you want to see my video of it, click the little box thing that'll pop up. In the game, you control E.T., who must find missing pieces of his telephone, which are in holes. So basically, you fall into holes and hope to find a piece of the telephone. Most of them are empty, and the process for getting out of the holes was difficult without falling back into them. To make the game more frustrating, the developers tried to give the Atari 2600's one action button multiple uses by having the use change depending on where E.T. was on the screen. E.T. could also gather pieces of candy. Enough of them could be redeemed for a telephone piece, which, depending on the difficulty setting, there may be a character that will steal them from you, or another character that will imprison E.T. if he's caught. The game was seen as difficult, unnecessarily confusing, and poorly made, with dated visuals even for 1982, and dull and frustrating gameplay. The urban legend goes that nobody bought the game and that it was a massive failure due to poor word of mouth and reviews. Atari tried to lower the price to sell copies, but it didn't help, and even tried giving away copies, but nobody wanted them. To finally dispose of the millions of unsold copies of E.T., Atari literally buried them in a desert in New Mexico. Want a free copy of the game? Just go to New Mexico and dig. There was even a music video done by the band Wintergreen about the E.T. legend, in which the band members are shown digging up old copies of the game, which miraculously are still in working order. E.T. is seen as one of the biggest commercial failures in video gaming and a major contributor to the video game crash's 1983, which saw the market for video game collapse, seeming that video games would become a relic of the past until a few years later when it was revived by Nintendo. It's a story that has been told over and over and over again over the last 28 years, but although there are elements of truth to it, it's largely nonsense. Firstly, the idea that E.T. sold poorly due to poor word of mouth and reviews is silly. First thing I'd like to point out about this is that this was 1982. There wasn't really an internet back then. The internet was something used basically only by the military and the most hardcore of nerds. There weren't tons of video game magazines, there weren't TV shows dedicated to it. Reviews were really something that wasn't happening on a grand scale. Back then, people went to the store and bought a game based on their own intuition and a quick glance at the box. Sometimes you'd play a game at a friend's house or hear about a new game, or maybe it was a port of an arcade title you were familiar with. But for the most part, people were flying blind. The fact is, E.T. sold actually quite well, over 1.5 million copies, making it one of the highest-selling video games for the system. E.T. was popular despite bad word of mouth. For the age-old reason, it was a licensed game based on an incredibly popular license, and it was released in the holiday season, making it a popular Christmas gift in 1982. So okay, what about the legend that unsold E.T. cartridges were buried in a desert in New Mexico? While there's truth to the story, the way it's told is usually deeply shrouded in legend. Although Atari did indeed bury a lot of stuff in New Mexico, it wasn't like they actually went out into the desert, dug a big hole, dumped cartridges in, and covered it up and left. It was actually done at a landfill in a town called Alamogordo. And don't expect to get your shovel and dig up a load of free Atari stuff. Aside from the fact that all the stuff would be quite deteriorated after many years, Atari chose this landfill specifically because they did not allow looting. Before being buried, the merchandise was run over with a steamroller, and after being buried, a concrete slab was poured over it. The reasoning behind this is said to be safety, as if a bunch of fuckwit kids tried to dig it up, a bunch of crushed up electronics could actually be pretty dangerous. And here's the kicker. Although I'm sure there were some ET cartridges buried there, it wasn't far from the only thing, and it's been said that most of what got buried was actually Atari 2600 consoles, not the cartridges. So why did Atari bury a bunch of their own merchandise? The official line from Atari at the time was that they were phasing out the Atari 2600 to make room for their new system, the Atari 5200. But this is probably also bullshit. You have to wonder why Atari would even give a reason for such a thing, but the fact was that the dumping was quite controversial at the time, with the residents of Alamogordo resenting the fact that they were getting tons of trash from a warehouse in El Paso, not wanting to become a dumping ground for another city. So when Atari officials were asked why they were even doing this, they felt the need to use this opportunity to promote the Atari 5200. The real reason can't really be known, but several alternatives have been proposed. The most credible came from an Atari employee named Bruce Enton that gave the simplest and most realistic reason for the dumping. The components being buried were broken, non-functioning, or otherwise unfit for sale. While it's true that he also used the word returned, and that the legend claims that most of the ET cartridges that were sold were returned for being terrible, the fact is when Atari refers to return merchandise, they're not talking about games that were sold and returned by unhappy customers. The fact is when you buy a game, you're not buying it from the company that made it, you're buying it from a retailer or a middleman. When game companies sell, they're selling to retailers, and when they get returns, they're getting returns from the retailers, which are usually unsold or defective copies. Besides, it's not like you can go to GameStop and return a game just because you don't like it. As I pointed out, despite its low quality, E.T. was actually quite the hit, and it sold very well. If there were unsold cartridges in the landfill, and I doubt that, it's far more likely that they were copies of Pac-Man, not E.T. Pac-Man, while considered a butchered port, was the top-selling Atari 2600 game of all time. It sold over 7 million copies. Just to give you a frame of reference, that's more copies than Halo. But Atari did something very stupid when creating their version of Pac-Man, something far worse than butchering the gameplay and graphics. They produced 12 million copies of the game, which was more than there were actual Atari 2600 consoles sold. They reasoned, quite stupidly, that people were so hot to trot to play a home version of Pac-Man that people who didn't have the Atari 2600 would run out and grab one just to play Pac-Man. This is another reason why I call bullshit on their unofficial statement of phasing out the 2600 in favor of the 5200. Obviously, they were planning on selling a lot more of those consoles, if only so people could play Pac-Man. Due to the fact that E.T. was actually a big seller and a financial success, it's hard to swallow that it was a major contributing factor to the video game crash, and that there are hundreds of thousands of unsold copies sitting in a landfill. But it makes much more sense to me that Pac-Man was the main contributor. The fact was that even though Pac-Man sold 7 million copies, that leaves 4 million without anywhere to go, and that the public's dissatisfaction with the game, coupled with the large amount of shovelware games coming out from developers who knew that their games would sell well despite low quality, as there was really nobody to warn consumers, that contributed to the video game crash. I'm sure E.T. didn't help, as it was indeed one of those many shovelware games with an infamously fast development cycle. A game completed in a matter of 6 weeks and rushed onto shelves to face a holiday season. But I think it was just one title of many that led to the crash. So no, you can't go out to New Mexico with a shovel and grab a copy of E.T., but the fact is they're not exactly rare. It's one of the most common Atari 2600 games out there, so if you're looking for one, instead of making an ass out of yourself in Alamogordo, try a flea market instead. Even the creator of the game, Howard Warshaw, and by the way, don't crucify the guy, he also made Yar's Revenge, claims that the idea of Atari burying hundreds of thousands of copies of a game is silly, that they would have most likely just recycled the parts for other games, instead of throwing them away. So to reiterate my main point, if there were old cartridges buried, it would have been Pac-Man, and it's probably nonsense anyway. The fact was Atari was just getting rid of broken or defective merchandise that had been taking up space in El Paso, and it was spun into a colorful urban legend over the years.